The tall man stepped out onto the porch, shoulders bent under the weight of something heavier than winter. His shirt sleeves were rolled despite the cold. His arms strong but his face lined with tired years. A scar cut through the stubble along his jaw, pale against wind-burned skin. He looked down the trail as though expecting no one, but when he saw his daughter leading a stranger, he froze. The girl ran ahead, her patched dress flaring like a little flag of courage. "Papa!" she called, voice clear against the hush of snow. She came. He blinked, confused. His eyes flicked to Ida, then back to his daughter. The girl tugged his hand. "She's the one. She's not leaving." Ida stood there, boots heavy, shawl clinging with frost. Shame tried to rise in her throat again, the echoes of laughter still ringing in her ears. But the child's grip was firm, and for once she did not drop her gaze. The man stepped down from the porch, slow, uncertain. His breath fogged between them. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes meeting hers. They were the same brown as the girl's, but hollowed, rimmed red as though sleep had been a stranger for months. "I'm sorry if she troubled you," he said at last, his voice rough, gravel carried on wind. "She's too bold sometimes." "She didn't trouble me," Ida whispered. Her words came thin but steady. Silence stretched, broken only by the creak of pines and the faint crackle from the chimney smoke. The girl squeezed both their hands, eyes darting from one to the other. "Papa, don't send her away." His jaw tightened. He looked at Ida again, studying her face the way a man studies weather, trying to see what storm might break. Finally, he said, softer this time, "You're cold. Come inside." The warmth of the cabin struck her as the door closed behind them. Firelight glowed against rough-hewn walls. A table stood with one chair pulled too far back, as if someone had once sat there and hadn't returned. The smell of wood smoke and stew clung to the air, though the pot on the stove was thin, nearly empty. The girl let go at last, darting to the hearth to stir the embers. Ida stood awkwardly, her suitcase still clutched, unsure if this was a kindness that would vanish as quickly as Wallace's promise. The man set his hands on the back of a chair. His knuckles were raw, his fingernails dark with soot. "I'm Silas," he said quietly. "This is Ruth." He nodded toward the girl. Ida swallowed, her throat tight. "Ida." For a moment, the only sound was the pop of sap in the fire. Then Ruth turned, beaming, her cheeks bright with heat and snowmelt. "See, Papa? She's real." Silas's gaze lingered on Ida's face, then dropped to her hands, her shawl, her suitcase tied with twine. Something softened in his expression, though he tried to hide it. "If you've come this far," he murmured, "you must have nowhere else to be." Ida felt her chest ache, but she lifted her chin. "Nowhere else," she admitted. And for the first time in years, those words didn't sound like failure. They sounded like the beginning of something neither of them had planned, but both of them desperately needed. That night, Ida lay awake on the narrow cot Ruth had dragged from the corner. The little girl had insisted, her tiny hands tugging at blankets twice her size, whispering, "You can't sleep cold. Papa says no one should." Silas hadn't argued. He'd only watched from his chair by the fire, his arms folded tight as if holding himself together. When Ida glanced at him, he'd looked away. Now the fire burned low, shadows flickering against the beams overhead. Ruth slept soundly, curled in a quilt on the rug beside her father's boots. Every few breaths, she murmured in her sleep, as though still dreaming of Ida's arrival. But Silas hadn't moved. He sat with elbows on his knees, staring into the embers like a man staring into old graves. His face was hard, but his eyes were not. They looked empty. Ida shifted on the cot. The wood creaked. "You should sleep," she whispered. Silas didn't answer at first. Then, without looking at her, he said, "I used to. Not anymore." Ida's chest tightened. She wanted to ask why, but something in the way his shoulders hunched told her the words might shatter him. So she stayed quiet, the hush of the cabin wrapping them both. Finally, his voice came again, low, as though he spoke to the fire itself. Her mother passed last winter. Fever. Took her in 3 days. She was 27. He paused. Ruth stopped talking for months after. Barely ate. Then one morning she woke and told me, "Papa, God's sending someone. You'll see." Been saying it ever since. He leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "Guess she thinks you're the answer." The words were not cruel, but neither were they tender. They were the weary confession of a man who had buried hope in the snow. Ida swallowed hard. "I'm not anyone's answer." Silas finally looked at her then. Really looked. His gaze lingered not on her size, but on her eyes, her trembling hands, the way she sat upright as though braced for blows that never came. He saw it, the years of scorn, the rawness of someone who'd walked too far with too little kindness. "Maybe not," he said at last, his voice rough. "But you came anyway." The fire cracked. Outside, wind pressed against the cabin walls, but the little room held warm. Ruth shifted in her sleep, sighing. Ida looked down at her hands, the calluses along her fingers. "I don't know what you need. I only know how to stay when it's hard." Something in Silas's jaw eased, though his eyes still carried storms. He leaned back in the chair, folding his arms once more. "Then stay," he said simply. The words weren't a promise, nor a plea, but they settled deep in Ida's chest, heavier than any vow she'd ever dreamed of. For the first time since stepping off that train, she felt the ground steady beneath her feet. She let her eyes close, her breath evening out with the fire's last glow. And though the night outside raged with winter, inside the cabin, something fragile but unbroken had begun to take root. The loft creaked beneath her boots as Ida stepped inside. The room smelled faintly of dust and cedar, a place forgotten rather than lived in. A narrow bed frame leaned against the wall with no mattress on it. An iron stove stood dark in the corner, its pipe running crooked up through the roof. The cold was sharp here, sharper than below, as though the walls themselves had forgotten warmth. Ida set her satchel down, the leather soft and worn from travel. She did not unpack, not yet. She simply sat on the edge of the frame, her arms around herself, listening. From below, she could hear Addie humming faintly, a sound too bright for the silence of this house. Then the door shut hard, and Beau's heavy footsteps faded into the snow. She was alone again. Her fingers went to the letter in her satchel. She drew it out, her eyes following every uneven line of ink as though it might still be true, as though the words might still belong to the man who had just walked away from her in the snow. "I don't care about looks. I want someone honest, someone who doesn't give up." Wallace's hand, not Beau's. Wallace's dream, not Beau's. And yet she had crossed miles with those words burning inside her. She had clung to them through nights on the train, through hunger, through the endless white of the plains. Now she sat in a loft that felt more like a barn than a bedroom, and for the first time, she wondered if the letter had been nothing but a cruel trick from the start. She pressed it flat, tucked it back, and whispered to the dark, "I don't give up." Below, the little girl's voice drifted upward. "Papa says it might snow harder tonight. Will you make biscuits in the morning?" Ida leaned against the post of the bed, closing her eyes. A small smile tugged at her lips despite the weight in her chest. Addie didn't ask if she would stay. She asked what she would cook. And just like that, something shifted. The cabin was broken. The man was hard, the welcome colder than the wind outside. But the child had opened the door without hesitation. Ida pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and lay back, staring at the beams above. She could still feel the sting of Beau's words. "I don't want love. I don't want promises. Just someone who works." They cut sharper than any blade. But Addie's soft humming still carried through the floorboards, fragile and steady as a heartbeat. Somehow Ida knew, whatever this house lacked, warmth, care, hope, Addie had not lost it all. And for that alone Ida would stay. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in weeks, she did not dream of leaving. She dreamed of firewood stacked high, of bread rising golden in an oven, of a place that might one day deserve the name home. The morning came with no kindness. Ida woke stiff, the loft air biting at her skin. Frost rimmed the edges of the single window, turning the glass into a pale sheet of ice. For a moment, she forgot where she was. She reached for the familiar creak of her old bed, the faint smell of her mother's bread cooling on a windowsill. But when her fingers brushed only splinters and dust, memory returned like a stone in her stomach. The cabin, the man, the child. She pushed herself up and wrapped her shawl tighter, her breath clouding in front of her face. The stove in the corner stood as empty as last night. No firewood, no warmth. If she wanted heat, she would have to earn it. Downstairs, she heard the scrape of a chair, the quick patter of Addie's feet. A low, steady voice spoke. It wasn't laughter or comfort, just the sound of a man who carried weight heavier than he could lay down. Ida climbed down the ladder and stepped into the kitchen. Addie sat at the table, her little hands folded under her chin, eyes bright. Bo stood at the hearth, coaxing weak flames from the ashes. He looked up once, just once, then back to the fire. Woodpiles out back. You'll need an axe. Ida nodded, though her stomach tightened. She had split wood before, but never in snow that swallowed her boots or with hands still numb from cold. Addie piped up, cheerful as ever. I can show you where the good logs are. Bo's jaw flexed. Inside, Addie. The girl slumped but stayed quiet. Ida moved toward the door, pulling her coat close. She did not argue. Not with him. Not yet. Outside, the world was white. Snow stretched in every direction, muffling sound, swallowing color. The woodpile leaned against the side of the cabin, half buried, the axe jutting out like a warning. She gripped it and felt the weight press down her shoulder. Her first swing was clumsy, the blade glancing off with a dull thud. The second struck truer, sending a sharp crack into the morning air. By the time she had a small stack, her palms burned raw and her breath came ragged. She carried the wood inside, her arms trembling. Addie clapped softly. She did it, Papa. Bo didn't look at her, only fed the logs into the fire. Don't praise a job halfway done, he muttered. But Ida caught the way his shoulders eased, just slightly, as the flames rose stronger. She set the remaining wood by the hearth, dusting snow from her coat. I'll fetch more after breakfast. That made him pause. His eyes lifted, steady and unreadable, as though testing if she meant it. When she didn't look away, he gave the faintest nod. Nothing more. Addie grinned as though she just witnessed a miracle. Ida moved toward the kitchen shelves. She studied the cracked pots, the crooked lids, the sack of flour slumped in the corner. Nothing came easy here. Nothing would. But she rolled up her sleeves anyway. Biscuits, she murmured, more to herself than to them. We'll start with biscuits. And for the first time, the cabin began to smell like something other than cold. No one asked her to, but she did it anyway. By dusk, the cabin bore her fingerprints in every corner. The air no longer smelled only of smoke and boiled turnips, but of soap, bread, and pine needles she had tucked in a jar above the stove. The curtain in the kitchen no longer sagged like a forgotten rag but caught the lamplight in a gentle glow. Even the warped shelves stood a little prouder. Addie noticed first. She twirled in the middle of the room with her doll, giggling, as though the cabin had been polished into a place where laughter was allowed. Bo noticed too, though he said nothing. He stepped into the kitchen that night with snow dusting his shoulders. His gaze lingered on the scrubbed window, the patched curtain, the straightened shelves. His jaw worked as though words pressed against his teeth. But in the end, none came. He sat down, pulled off his gloves, and said only, "Woodpile's low." Ida nodded, wiping her damp hands on her apron. "I'll see to it tomorrow." And that was the rhythm of them. He gave instructions. She followed sometimes. More often, she simply acted before the words were spoken. When the fence posts sagged beneath the snow, she braced them with rope. When Addie outgrew her only winter dress, Ida pieced together scraps into a patchwork that made the girl beam. When the axe handle split, she bound it in leather strips until it swung true again. Bo said little, but he watched, and when he thought she wasn't looking, his eyes softened in the quietest, most dangerous way. Still, silence carried its own weight. Some nights it pressed against her ribs until she thought she might choke. One evening, after scrubbing the last dish, she leaned against the counter and whispered, almost to herself, "A home shouldn't feel like a burden." The words slipped out. She hadn't meant him to hear, but Bo looked up from his chair. His knife paused mid-shave against the block of wood he was whittling. His brow furrowed, not in anger, just in thought. Then he said something she never expected. Didn't know it could feel like anything else. The admission sat heavy in the room, startling in its honesty. Ida froze, dishcloth limp in her hand, heart hammering. She wanted to ask more, wanted to peel back the silence until she reached the man behind it. But his eyes dropped, his knife scraped again, and the moment folded shut like a book. Yet the words stayed with her. He didn't know, which meant maybe, just maybe, he could learn. The words stayed with her long after the fire had burned low. Didn't know it could feel like anything else. She lay awake in the loft that night, staring at the beams overhead, listening to the faint crackle of coals. Bo's voice replayed in her mind, not harsh or cutting, but raw. She thought of the letter in the drawer, of the man who had nearly given up. And she thought of Addie, whose small laugh rang like a bell in the dark corners of the house. By morning, her resolve had hardened. She rose before dawn, gathering snow in a bucket to melt for washing. She scrubbed the smoke-caked walls until gray water filled the basin. She pried up warped floorboards near the sink, one by one, cleaning away the mildew that had rotted them for years. Her knuckles split, her back ached, but she kept going. Every stroke of the brush, every nail hammered back into place, was her way of saying, "This house will not be death. It will not be silence. It will hold life again." Addie helped in her small ways, passing nails, holding cloth, singing while Ida worked. Bo watched in his own quieter way. At first, his gaze was wary, as if braced for her to quit like others must have before. But days turned into weeks, and Ida never slowed. One evening, Bo came in with a bundle of cedar branches. He dropped them by the stove without a word. The sharp, clean scent filled the room, chasing out years of stale smoke. Ida paused, her hands still damp from scrubbing, and looked at him. He didn't meet her eyes, just muttered, "Figured it'd smell better." She wanted to smile, wanted to say thank you, but she understood him well enough now to know silence was the safer reply. So she just nodded and kept working. Winter pressed harder. Snow piled high against the cabin walls. Howling winds rattled the shutters, and every trip to the woodshed felt like walking into a frozen battlefield. The three of them huddled close to the fire on the worst nights. Addie would curl in her lap, her small hand clutching the fabric of Ida's dress, while Bo sat across from them, boots planted, knife scraping slow against wood. It was in those nights, with the storm clawing at the cabin, that Ida began to see it, the faint outline of a man beneath the armor. Not just a provider, not just a judge, but a father clinging to what little he had left. A man who had once been close to breaking. And one night, when the wind screamed loud enough to shake the walls, she did something reckless. She spoke into the silence. "Bo," she said softly, his knife paused. He glanced up. "You're not the only one who thought of leaving the world behind." The room went very still. Addie shifted in her sleep, pressing her face against Ida's arm. Bo's eyes darkened, unreadable. His jaw tightened. For a long while he said nothing at all. Then, in a voice low and rough as gravel, he asked, "What stopped you?" Ida looked down at the sleeping child. Her throat burned. Not what? Who? Something flickered across his face, too quick to name. His hands dropped from the knife. For the first time since she'd come, he didn't look away. He held her gaze until the fire snapped between them. Two people bound not by blood, but by wounds deep enough to recognize each other. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was something neither of them had believed possible only weeks before. It was trust beginning. The storm raged on through the night, but inside the broken cabin, the air shifted. Not warmth, at least not yet, but a promise, like a fire waiting for a spark. Bo's grip never loosened around Ida and Miriam, even as the cold gnawed at his bones. He kept pressing them closer, his chin tucked against Ida's crown, his breath rough against her hair. Every few minutes, Miriam would stir, whimpering, and he would answer softly, "Papa's here. Don't you worry, little rabbit." When dawn broke, it did not come with sun. Only a gray light filtered through the cracks of the battered roof. The blizzard had buried the cabin nearly to its windows. Bo shifted stiffly, muscles burning from holding them so long. He looked down at Ida, her lashes rimmed with ice, lips cracked, hands raw from shielding Miriam. She hadn't thought of herself once. He brushed his thumb over her knuckles, rough on rough, but careful. "You fool," he muttered, voice hoarse. "You near froze yourself to death." Her eyelids fluttered, heavy. "Better me than her," she whispered, barely audible. Something broke inside him at that. He had thought of her as strong before, but strength had always seemed to him a thing of muscle, of fists and grit. This was strength too, but deeper. Quiet, stubborn, relentless. It made his chest ache. By noon, he had forced the door half open and dug a narrow path through the snow with his bare hands until he found the hatchet he'd left outside. His movements were clumsy from fatigue, but he worked anyway, chopping through ice, gathering wood, building a fire on the hearth's edge. Smoke rose again, curling warm against the rafters. Ida stirred at last, the heat touching her face. Miriam slept tucked against her side, cheeks pinking slowly. Bo crouched beside them, watching. He did not know how to speak what pressed inside his chest, so he reached instead for the enamel cup on the shelf, the one he'd placed the flower in days before. This time, he filled it with melted snow, set it by her hand. When she woke, her eyes landed on it. A simple thing, but her lips parted just slightly, as if it was more than water, maybe an answer she hadn't dared hope for. That night, after Miriam was asleep, Ida sat at the hearth mending a shirt sleeve by firelight. Bo watched her hands move, steady and sure, the needle glinting with each stitch. Finally, he spoke. "You weren't meant to stay here," he said, his voice low. She looked up, startled, as if bracing to be dismissed. "You could have left after the first storm, after the first harsh word from me. But you didn't." Her hands stilled. "I didn't stay for you," she said quietly. "I stayed for them." Bo's gaze flicked to the loft where the children slept. "I know." He hesitated, his throat working. "But still you stayed." The fire popped, sending sparks upward. Ida bent her head again, though her eyes glistened in the flicker. Outside, the wind still whistled through the trees, but inside, something new was growing. Not loud, not sudden, but steady, like a seed under snow waiting for spring. The days after the storm pressed down heavy. Snow still banked high against the cabin walls, trapping them in a pocket of silence. The world outside was muffled, softened, but inside, life demanded to move forward. Bo rose before dawn each morning, breaking the ice crust to fetch water, chopping wood until his arms trembled. Ida tended the hearth, stretching what little food remained into meals that somehow filled the room with warmth if not abundance. The children clung close, still shaken from the collapse, their laughter quieter now, their eyes following every move the adults made. One evening, when the wind had eased, Bo sat sharpening his new axe head by the fire. The scrape of stone on steel filled the silence. Across from him, Ida patched Miriam's coat, her fingers stiff from the cold but unyielding. The firelight played against her hair, strands escaping her kerchief, and Bo caught himself watching. Not just watching, studying, as if trying to memorize something he had overlooked too long. "You work like you belong here," he said suddenly. The words left him rougher than he meant. Her hands paused. "I don't," she answered, steady but quiet. He frowned. "Why do you say that?" "Because I was only ever meant to pass through. Help a while. Earn my keep. Then go." She tied off the last stitch, smoothed the fabric. That was the plan. Bo set the axe aside, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. And now, Ida looked into the fire, the flames reflecting in her tired eyes. Plans change. It was not a promise, not even a declaration, just a simple truth, spoken into the smoke and sparks. Yet Bo felt something shift inside him at the words, like ice cracking on a river. Later that night, long after the children had curled into sleep, Ida lingered by the dying fire, folding clothes into neat stacks. Bo stood in the doorway, one hand braced against the frame. He wanted to speak, to tell her what her staying meant, to admit how her presence had steadied him in ways he hadn't thought possible. But the words stuck like splinters in his throat. Instead, he crossed the room, picked up the smallest pile of folded shirts, and placed them carefully on the shelf beside hers. It was the first time he had ever shared the space that way. Ida noticed. She said nothing, but when she blew out the lantern, there was the faintest curve at the corner of her lips, a softness Bo had never seen there before. In the quiet that followed, with the storm finally breaking outside, the cabin did not feel like a place of strangers anymore. It felt, for the first time, like the beginnings of a home. Her fingers hovered just above the box, hesitant, as though opening it might break the fragile peace that had settled between them. Bo nodded once, urging her forward. Slowly, Ida lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a piece of worn cloth, lay a set of finely carved spoons, 3 of them, each one different but shaped with the same patient hand. The largest bore the carving of a pine tree, tall and steady, its branches etched with care. The second held the shape of a river, winding and flowing, carved so delicately the lines looked alive. The smallest, made for hands not yet grown, was adorned with the outline of a bird, wings outstretched as if ready to take flight. Ida's throat tightened. She picked up the smallest spoon, running her thumb over the grooves, the wood polished smooth from hours of sanding. "For Miriam," she whispered. Bo's jaw shifted. "For all of us," he corrected softly. His voice was low, but steady, like the sound of earth splitting for spring roots. "A table to sit at, place to eat. Not just me, not just you, but together." Ida blinked hard, swallowing against the knot in her throat. She had not expected this. A man who once held his silence like armor now carving not just wood, but meaning. Not just a table, but a promise. She set the spoon back gently, then looked up. "You built this," she said, though the words carried more weight than the wood in front of her. Bo nodded. "It's what I know how to do. I can't give you much. Can't promise I'll never fail. But—" He paused, his shoulders broad, his hands raw and scarred, twisting against one another. "I can try. I want to try." Silence stretched, but it was not empty. It was full, rich, the kind that hums between two people standing at the edge of something new. Ida stepped closer. Her hand, worn from work, rested briefly over his rough knuckles. Not a pledge. Not yet. But an answer. Behind them, Miriam stirred in her blanket, lifting her head. "Mama?" she mumbled drowsily, eyes still half closed. Ida turned, her lips trembling into a smile. "Yes, little bird," she whispered. Bo's eyes caught hers then, and though neither spoke it aloud, the word lingered between them like a living thing, fragile yet fierce. That morning, sunlight poured through the frost glass windows, striking the cedar table and the carved spoons until they glowed. For the first time in years, the cabin did not feel like a monument to grief. Felt like a beginning. Spring came slow, but it came. The snow shrank back from the fields, trickling into streams that swelled and sang through the valley. The air, once sharp enough to bite the lungs, now carried the smell of wet earth and pine. Bo turned the soil behind the cabin, his shoulders bent, the shovel sinking deep into ground that had not been touched since Clara's hands last pressed seeds there. Ida stood on the porch, Miriam clinging to her skirts, watching him. It was not the work alone that caught her breath, but the way he moved with quiet purpose, as though each turn of soil was a promise he intended to keep. When he straightened, sweat dampening his shirt, he glanced up at her. "This land should feed us again," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried in the clean spring air. Ida nodded, a warmth rising in her chest that had nothing to do with the sun. She took Miriam's small hand and led her down to the patch. Kneeling beside Bo together, the three pressed seeds into the soil: corn, beans, and squash, the old trio the settlers had whispered about, though Ida had never planted them before. Miriam giggled when dirt smeared across her nose, and Bo's deep chuckle joined hers, a sound Ida hadn't known she needed until it echoed in her ears. At night, the cabin glowed with the lamplight of small rituals. Bo read aloud from the only book he owned, a Bible with worn pages and Clara's name written in the front. He did not preach, did not press meaning, only let the words roll steady into the room like river water. Miriam curled in Ida's lap, half asleep, listening. Ida sewed by the fire, stitching the holes in Bo's gloves with thread she had saved from her old life. "You should have told me sooner," she teased once, holding up the patchwork glove. Bo shrugged, but there was the faintest smile under his beard. "You'd have scolded me." "I still might." But the scolding never came. Instead, laughter did, quiet, careful at first, then freer as days unfolded into weeks. One evening, when the air had warmed enough to keep the door cracked, Bo came in carrying something behind his back. Miriam rushed forward, bouncing on her toes. "What is it, Papa?" she asked without thinking. The words slipped out like breath, unmeant, but once spoken, it filled the room. Bo froze, his eyes wide, his whole body stiff. Ida's heart pounded. She started to hush Miriam, to tell her it wasn't right. But then she saw the look on Bo's face, stunned, raw, and almost fragile. He crouched down slowly until his eyes were level with the child's. "What did you call me?" he asked softly. Miriam chewed her lip, suddenly shy, but whispered, "Papa." Bo swallowed hard. He pulled the bundle from behind his back, a small wooden horse he had carved, its legs uneven but its head noble. He placed it in her hands. His voice cracked as he said, "Then I best act like one." Ida turned away, tears burning her eyes. She gripped the doorframe, steadying herself. The storm that had once nearly killed them had melted into this, a moment no blizzard could bury. The days grew longer. The garden sprouted. Life inch by inch began again. And saddle up with us for more stories that remind us that the strongest bonds aren't forged in comfort, but in fire. Because this wasn't just about Bo and Ida McCrae. It was about every woman who had been told she was unworthy, every man who believed his scars made him unfit to love, every soul who thought the storm would swallow them whole. Their story was proof that storms break, hearts mend, and love, when chosen with courage, can build a life sturdier than steel. The McCrae's cabin stood as a beacon long after their names faded from ledgers and town gossip. Children learned their first letters by Ida's hand. Men earned their wages by Bo's honest work. Neighbors who once scorned them came for advice, came for comfort, came for warmth when winter returned hard and hungry. And though the years etched lines on their faces, the fire between them never dimmed. On the mantel, the ring still caught the light, black steel polished by time, the words "not mercy," choice standing as tall as ever. A vow not just of love but of dignity, of freedom, of two people deciding that the world could not dictate their worth. And so, when the wind howled across the ridge, it did not sound like loneliness anymore. It sounded like music, like laughter spilling through the cracks of the little sawmill, like the hammer striking true on the anvil, like a child's voice reading aloud by lamplight. It sounded like home. Because in the end, the story of Bo and Ida McCrae wasn't just survival or even romance. It was the story of how two broken people refused to remain broken, of how shame can be burned away by choice, of how love, plain and unadorned, can stand taller than mountains. And if you listen close enough, you'll still hear it on the Wyoming wind. A storm tried to break them. Instead, it built them. Decades passed. The little cabin on the ridge grew weathered, its wood silvered by wind and snow. But it never fell, just like the people who had built it. Their daughter, Lena McCrae, grew tall and strong, her hair wild like her mother's laughter and her hands steady like her father's. She learned her letters at Ida's side, and her first lesson in strength by watching Bo lift timbers twice his weight without complaint. By 16, she was already her own kind of storm, quick to defend the small, stubborn in the face of cruelty, and brave enough to dream bigger than the canyon walls that cradled her home. When the first railroad line reached the valley, strangers arrived with polished boots and slick promises. Some tried to buy out the sawmill. Others mocked the rough cabin, the plain furniture, the dirt roads. Lena met them with her mother's fire. My father built this mill with his back. My mother built this town with her words. And you think you can buy it with gold? She said once, standing on the porch with her chin lifted. The men left with red ears and no deal. Ida only smiled. That's my girl, she whispered. Bo, slower now, still swung his axe. Each thud into the wood echoed years of faithfulness. His beard had turned white, but his eyes still softened every time Ida entered a room. Even after 30 years, he rose when she walked in, as though love had made him a boy again. One winter, when the snow piled high and the town seemed swallowed in silence, Lena sat by the fire reading aloud from her mother's notebook, the same one Ida had filled with words for women who thought they were too much or not enough. She read every line like scripture, her voice steady even when tears pressed hot at the edges. Bo reached over and held Ida's hand. You see, May, he said, his voice rough but certain. Your words outlive us. They'll outlive this town. That's what lasts. And he was right. When, at last, time carried Bo and then Ida into the quiet earth of the Wyoming Ridge, their story didn't die with them. The cabin remained, the sawmill thrummed, and Lena taught children from the same uneven floors her mother had once swept. Above the hearth, the black ring still gleamed. Its inscription, weathered but unbroken, caught the light every dawn. Subscribe to Legend of Love Stories for tales of grit, healing, and unexpected romance in the untamed frontier. There's always another fire to warm your soul, and another story waiting just around the bend. Out here, the wind carries secrets, the mountains hold promises, and every heart learns that love can take root in the roughest soil. Don't just watch history,